The red dot?
That red light.
Okay.
So we're live.
Okay. And when Linda comes in, we'll swap out, we'll put in her slides and it just continues. Captures whatever's on the screen. Okay. Darlene, hi. Good. Just have to climb over the desk. I know. We put some extra chairs over here. So, oh, and we're being taped. So, speaking of my phone. We're going to get started, people who are listening from afar, in just a few minutes. Yeah. right now? I would just want to grab a few more. Maybe when Linda's talking, I'll do that. Okay. Okay. Evening, everybody. Thank you. So excited to fill up this room. You know I have to talk in the microphone. Thank you, Anna. We're so happy to have you. This is Epidemics of Injustice, and I'm going to be the instructor for this semester, but this is a class in which we all learn from each other, so I'm really in this happy position of facilitating learning together rather than delivering education from this podium, so that's actually where I'm happiest. And Susan, why don't you come on up? We want to take a few minutes just to welcome you to this kind of unique space and give you a little bit of description about what this is. So just to characterize who's in the room, can you just raise your hand if you're registered as a student in this class? Okay, awesome. And then you can see from those who didn't raise their hand, those are our guests. And every week for the first hour, we're going to welcome guests in this classroom. And that's part of our philosophy of trying to be more inclusive and more open to our community of learners outside of those registered for the class.
And can we see of the people who aren't registered, how many are from outside of the School of Public Health?
Who are not registered.
Of the people who aren't registered, right, how many aren't students or faculty of the School of Public Health? Yeah, okay. Whichever.
Right.
Awesome.
And that's another part of what we're trying to do here is bring together people who represent a lot of different expertises or disciplines to really learn together. So the way this class is going to work, I just have a few slides and then I'll introduce myself, and Io, our course TA, just walked down the hallway to get us a few more chairs. We might be a little packed in here for our first hour when we have our guests, and then after our guest lecture, we'll take a break, and then I'll just be the students registered in class, so we won't be quite so packed. But we actually like having a packed class. It demonstrates the enthusiasm for this content and for this course. So, okay. People can also sit on the floor over here if you want, until we get folding chairs, if anyone's standing over there. So I know a lot of you because I've taught a lot of you in other classes, but I'm an assistant professor in the Division of Community Health Sciences. My name is Jenny Hebert-Byrne. I've been at this school doing research and teaching for 8 years, and before that I was at the Chicago Department of Public Health. Hello, ladies. And working in nonprofit work. So I've been in Chicago most of my adult life doing this work. You're laughing at me.
Well, it goes quickly, right?
Yeah.
And it ends up being most of your adult life.
Yeah. And this class this semester is on structural violence and focused on Chicago. And our first guest, Linda Ray Murray, is going to kick us off, and we'll really hope that every semester that we get a chance to teach this class, she'll launch this class and help us to really frame how we understand public health inequities in the city of Chicago. So again, I'm the facilitator of learning, but this is about bringing in people outside of our school and other kinds of experts into the class. So this class is co-developed by our Radical Public Health group. So could you raise your hand if you're a member of Radical Public Health, knowing that if you attend events and participate on our listserv, you're a member. So there was about 15 of us that worked together in developing this class, identifying the speakers, identifying the action labs, and the Radical Public Health members in this class and the guests who will come and join us will contribute to our learning and explain a little bit more about what Radical Public Health. So what we're trying to do in this class is really one of Radical Public Health's missions is to really bring a more critical lens to our public health teaching, practice, and research. With this semester really thinking about structural violence. We are using these action labs, which just the students registered for the class are involved in, to really bring some experiences that give us more concrete skills, knowledge, kind of build our capacity to address what we see as these structural determinants of health inequities or structural drivers. You'll see in the assignments, and we'll talk a lot about this later, what the assignments are in this class. It's a lot about self-reflection. We want you to really come prepared for class, do the readings, and contribute to the class experience, because that's what it's all about. And And so I know Dr. Altfeld wants to welcome the class because the Dean's Office has provided some important support to make this class happen, and we're grateful for that.
So I'm Susan Altfeld. For those of you I don't know, I'm Associate Dean for Academic Affairs here at the School of Public Health, and we kicked off this class last year as a partnership with Radical Public Health, as Jenny explained, and the Dean's Office. And Radical Public Health approached me to see if we could make this class happen. That was kind of late in the fall, actually, of 2017. And we worked really hard. We worked really hard over the break to make it happen and to launch it. And we were both pleased and surprised at our success, which was really great. We also had a full room then, and I think people really got a lot out of it. And one of the most important things, I think, was that it really was a place for those of us here to express the principles of health equity and social justice that are front and center in our mission statement, but often seem missing from the day-to-day events of the school, the courses and the meetings and the day-to-day work of the school. So this is really a way for those of us which is many of us here at the school, who have that as very central to their motivation for being involved in public health, to really give voice to that and have some solidarity in a group of like-minded people. Initially, I think it's really appropriate to call it despair over the 2016 elections, provoked people to do something. And that was really where the impetus for this course started. So I'm really glad that we've been able to make it happen and want to welcome you on behalf of the Dean's Office.
Ilo, our TA, will be distributing chairs, and she has a formal bio to introduce Linda. So I knew she was going to say that. She probably got Io to walk out of the classroom and say, I'm going to open your slides for you and just say, I'll say the briefest thing so she doesn't get upset, but I would say that, most of the people in this class have learned from Linda in some way or the other, and we really we're just really pleased that she supports this class and Radical Public Health, and so welcome to the class and anything you have to contribute to it.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So first of all, I'm really honored to be able to open this discussion, and that's what you should treat this as, a seminar discussion class, even though it's a huge number. I might say that I intend to come to the next several classes, so you might have to move to the auditorium. Next week we'll have Charlene Crothers. The next class, which as you know is every other week, we'll have Charlene Crothers here. She has a new book out. And after that, we have one of our really leading scholars on campus, David Stovall, who will be talking about structural violence. And so that's just the next two people. So maybe meeting in the auditorium and then going to the action labs might be a real plan. So I have an interesting task. At least I gave myself an interesting task. I really don't want to talk very much about this title. I'll try to do that. But I don't really want to do that. I really feel like my goal today is to convince you that you got to do more reading and thinking and arguing. That's what I really want to talk about. I'm gonna have some challenges about what the hell this concept means and what are we really talking about here. The first thing let me just say about the title is that when you think about structural violence, seating it only in Chicago is the first problem. Because you can't talk about structural violence in Chicago without talking about it in the United States, etc. So, but that's the title. We'll see it. The second thing I want to say is, if you have to give a lecture, never give slides like this. But and we're going to give people the slides, I don't know, outside of Blackboard also, right? Hopefully. We'll figure it out. So, and I'm not going to read all these slides. They're here to stimulate you when you look at them later, to think about them. So let me ask someone, where did this concept of structural violence come from? Does anybody know? Okay, you don't have to. Anybody here with a bachelor's in sociology? One. Okay. One. That's all we got. Two. Okay. Three. All right. See. Okay. So one of the real important things to remember about public health is that we are, first of all, a multidisciplinary field. We have lots of different people with all kinds of disciplines, obviously, especially in healthcare, who work in public health. And we are also an interdisciplinary field. So while some of my colleagues might argue with me, I would argue that most of what we learn, most of what we do as, quote, scientists, come to us from other traditional disciplines. And finally, I want to say at the end that what we need to become is a transdisciplinary field. But I'm going to suggest to you many books, and let me start with this book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. This is Frederick Engels, for those of you that don't know. Again, I'm not going to read all of this. He argues in this classic book that good people from, do they still make you read that in sociology? No? Yes, yes. There you go. All right. He really talks about structural violence in an eloquent way. This book was written in 1845. So when you hear someone talk about adverse child events, your blood pressure might go up like mine. That's my real goal here. So, or trauma-informed care, then I start getting a headache. Not because I think those things are bad, but because they are done without any understanding of where these concepts come from. So in this particular book, which is a good thing to read for lots of reasons, he goes into excruciating detail about what goes on in the English working class and argues, I think, clearly for structural violence. The part I highlighted in yellow there, that society in England daily and hourly commits what the working men's organs damage to them with perfect correctness characterized as social murder, which I think is another way to talk about structural violence, social murder. And then he goes on to define in what, of course, are Marxist terms, what that means. He's not just talking about society in general, he's talking about specifically the ruling class, the people that own the power. So here in 1845, you have seeded a clear theoretical framework that he and Marx and others worked on, and this concept of social murder doesn't make sense outside of some theoretical framework. So to talk about structural violence without having some understanding of, and that's just one. Let me just also say, I'm an American. I only speak English, which means I'm in trouble. Okay, so like if you read another language, don't lose that and read. This is from the English literature that I have available to read. There's lots of other people all over the world writing in other languages that are talking about these concepts, but unfortunately, I'm not in a position to intelligently discuss them. What most people will say to you today when they talk about structural violence, they'll talk about this guy, Joanne Galtung. And I went, and again, when you read about these people, I'll give you another hint. You all the students. Don't just take someone's summary for what they said or what they thought. Okay? So if you start reading about structural violence, if the people are academic enough, they'll mention him and they'll give you a reference. Go pull the reference and see what the hell he really said. Because layered on top of his first notion, he was a person that worked around peace and mental health. He was a Norwegian sociologist. People change these concepts. It's not that they're doing something evil necessarily. It's just that they change. And so you need to understand how they changed and why they changed. I included this diagram here because he's often argued to be the father of structural violence. And you can see in this first diagram from 1969, he says right there that structural violence is also social injustice. So we have stripped, let me be careful how I say this, much of American public health and medical care has stripped this original meaning away from structural violence. But it was in his first paper that is widely quoted in 69. So And one of the reasons that he thinks that it's so important and why he's writing about it is because he argues that this structural violence is invisible. It seems natural. Personal violence, if I take a gun and shoot you, everybody, you can see that. So he's really making an argument that the violence that we really need to pay attention to is the invisible structural violence that's based on social injustice. I'm happy with that definition, but the real question is, how is this used and how should we think about it in public health? Another set of information that you might want to look at is, I have James, see, this is my mind going bad here. James Farmer was a black civil rights leader, an important figure, but this is really Paul Farmer. Yeah, I just renamed him, right? This is really Paul Farmer, I'm sorry for that, who's done a lot of excellent work around HIV and tuberculosis, famous for working in Haiti. He has written about structural violence in a way that clinicians can understand. And so he has a bunch of work where he tries to explain what's really going on. Why is it that the AIDS epidemic is so bad in Haiti? It's not because Haitians are stupid or because they don't have enough doctors. He really talks about structural violence. I wanted to include this little, at least I had him write down at the bottom there, Paul Farmer, his quote about Haiti. And he's done much of his work, not all of it, much of his work on Haiti. And when he first went there, he really took time to read the history of the country and have an understanding of what Haiti was. And this is important as we get ready to evidently invade Venezuela. When I was coming home, I don't know what the president's doing. But anyway, he points out that Haiti is the first revolution in the hemisphere. It founded the first black republic. It was the first anti-slave revolution in this hemisphere. It tried to help Simon Bolivar to liberate countries in Latin America. And he argues in his writing, and I certainly agree with him, this is part of the reason that Haiti's in trouble today, because they had the nerve in 1804 to have a revolution. So if we agree, I'm not supposed to move because we're recording, right? Okay, that's all right. If we agree then with this basic definition of structural violence, which I would argue most of you knew before you walked in the room, what we were talking about, how does this manifest itself in Chicago, and what can we do about it? So, as you know, there were people here before Baptiste de Sable, and in fact, immediately before white settlers came, you had eastern tribes that had already been pushed west. But this particular area of the hemisphere of this continent certainly was an important gathering place. It was an agrarian location. It wasn't like wilderness, and people were removed. Let's look for a minute. So the first thing I would say is, it's not enough to have this generic notion in your mind that, well, we stole the country from the Native Americans, which we did. Well, you know what I mean. Which was done in our name. That's not enough. That doesn't help you really understand the story. I guess that's the big issue. Why I think this course is so important. Because the very fact that you're in this course means you're already sort of biased toward this thinking. Already. Okay? But it's not enough just to say, well, slavery was bad and we shouldn't have stolen, we shouldn't have committed genocide on Native Americans. That's not adequate if we're going to actually address the health problems that people face in a structural way. We're going to look at the structural foundations of what produces health and disease. So we need to, you don't have to memorize it, but you need to actually take time and understand, how did these structures come to be? This happens to be just one small listing, because we don't have that long today, of the treaties, just one way of looking, the treaties that systematically stole the land and how they stole the land. There was a treaty in I forgot, it's like over 100 treaties that we violate all the time, but the treaty in 1768 was a treaty that sort of said, okay, white people are going to stay east of the Ohio River, and everything else will be cool. So obviously that didn't happen. But that set the Ohio River as a boundary. And then in 1795, the United States government got 2/3 of Ohio, and it got critical parts of the water transportation system. So here's something else that I want to emphasize. You don't have to be a civil engineer, but you have to have some understanding of what you need to control a territory, what you need to get riches out of the territory. So they didn't ask for everything right away. They just said, yo, give us control, give us the right to use some of these waterways. So the mouth of the Chicago River, where at Fort Dearborn you can still see the plaque today. The portage, that's means for those of you that are like city people like me, that's where you can carry your canoes between waterways. So the portage land between the Chicago and Des Plaines River and the mouth of the Illinois River. This allows you to move commerce around. Then in 1816, the Treaty of St. Louis, and I've listed some of the English names that these nations used, were called by, ceded the corridor, the Chicago River corridor, which allowed, again, the United States to link Lake Michigan with the Mississippi. See how this is building up? So when you start having the Industrial Revolution and things like that. 1821, we got the land of Southwest Michigan and the right to build a road between Chicago and Detroit, completed in 1835. In 1929, this treaty extended the land a little bit further west, and the infamous treaty of there was a war against the Blackhawks, as in Black Hawk hockey team, a war against the Blackhawks in 1832, and the treaty of 1833, the Treaty of Chicago, where the Potawatomi ceded their last land in Illinois, Wisconsin, their last reservations in Michigan. So these are people that had, some of whom had already been displaced from the eastern coast, now are displaced again west of the Mississippi. This is just a map of the little green spaces are the trails and the portage areas that Native Americans used, and this map, not surprisingly, mirrors the interstate highway. This is not the highway map. This is from 1803 or 1804. So this is a map of Indian trails in our area, which is exactly what we use today to drive around. Now, I want to be careful how I say this, because I think one of the things that if you saw the hullabaloo from D.C., one of the things that it's easy to forget is we committed genocide against Native Americans, but the United States government was unable to wipe them out. They are still here, alive and well, and fighting back. So I don't want to act like everybody disappeared after the Treaty of Chicago. But nonetheless, the population went way down and did not go up again until later on after the war. In 1956, the United States government, after figuring out that they hadn't killed all of them, decided that they should disturb them on their reservations. This is when the boarding school stuff went up, and they had this Indian Relocation Act. It wasn't like, would you like to move to Chicago? No, it was like, yeah, let's move it. You know, that's what happened, okay? And so people were forced off their reservation lands, and Chicago was one of the places that they were told they were going to go to. And so you had a whole mixture of people, not just people who originally were from this area or Eastern tribes. You had a mixture of people from all over the country who came to Chicago. This is the picture of the old American Indian Center. It's closed down, and when it closed too long, it's moved to a newer place. And Native Americans, when they first came to Chicago, moved to Uptown. As you can see at the bottom, Uptown was known as Hillbilly Heaven and Redskin Row. When I came to Chicago in the mid-'60s, Uptown was like one of the baddest neighborhoods in the city because you had hillbillies who, you know, quote, redskins. Today, we have the third largest urban population of Native Americans in the country, about 65,000, and there's a vibrant community. I didn't put any books because I couldn't find them real quick on here, but there are a number of books about Native Americans in the city of Chicago. They tend to be focused on the upper class, but, you know, that's okay. It's still there. So I'll try to remember to send them to the TA so you can have them. So it's not simply that the land was stolen. It's what happens after the land is stolen. What happens when you try to run a pipeline through the land? What happens with the treaties that it still should be enforced today? Okay, what's going on with all of that? And I want to take a minute and talk about what we did before cell phones. So somebody took these pictures. This is the famous Chicago race riot of 1919. We're celebrating or commemorating the 100th anniversary of that in Chicago today. Actually, I don't know if we're commemorating it as well as we should, but anyway, we'll see what happens. And I'm not going to recite that history to you, except to talk about a report that was done and published in 1922. That's why this is on here. That was like 750 or 800 pages. Jenny, you ought to get it and put it in your syllabus. It was written by the Chicago Commission on Human Relations. And it is eloquently done. I'm going to call it a community health assessment, but it wasn't just that. It described everything. But this picture, the one on top, is the first one in this slide. So basically, some stuff went down on the lakefront. A riot came. This is a mob of whites chasing a black man into his house. You can see him down at the bottom where they knocked him from these stairs down and then killed him with bricks, beating him with the bricks. And the last picture here on the right at the bottom are the police there when that's going on. So this verbiage is from that report. Okay, so it's not some person being crazy. It's from that report. So the report covered a whole bunch of things. It covered the race riots in Springfield, in case you didn't know that happened. But it had stuff there on demographics, employment, criminal justice system, which, by the way, their criticisms of the police were exactly what we say today. Exactly. Okay. This is mostly white men. There was one black doctor, I think, on there. I don't know if there was more than one. But most of the people who wrote this report were white men. They talked about community assets. Okay. So this is help me, Olivet Baptist. I'm asking Mildred to help me. This is Olivet Baptist Church, which at the time was the largest black church in the city. In that map, which is hard to see, just look at the black dots. Those were all the churches. Now think about this. We don't have a map like this today, unfortunately. We could make one, but we don't have one. This is all the churches, of which there were 63, and then they had 92 storefront churches in the black community. So this report really goes into great detail. It exists as a PDF. Just Google it. I wanted to mention this book here. This is a more recent book than the 1922 report, which I think is an excellent book that really talks about the structural foundations of power and inequality in Chicago. So Andrew Diamond wrote this book. We waited for a couple. He wrote it in French first. So who in France would read this? I don't know. But he wrote it in French first. And we had to wait for a year or two or three to get it for it to be translated into English. So this information is out here. This is what we should be reading. This is what should be in our courses if we really want to talk about how inequality happens. Or more importantly, how society works. See, this is the problem we have in public health. So we think, unfortunately, too much like American doctors. Because not all doctors think this way. And so we always think in terms of disease. We talk about how is inequality made. But in fact, when you really carefully think about this, it's really what makes society work. That's really what we want to look. Because what I really want to know is, how do you make a society healthy and equal? That's what I want to know. I don't really want to know just how we got in this mess. I want to know how to get out of the mess. So the structural determinants don't just operate to make inequality. Theoretically, they can operate to make things socially just. And we have to begin talking about that and thinking about that and making sure that the issues that we look at are those issues. This is where things which I know hopefully some of you have known about, the redlining, the books that talk about that, the books that talk about Reconstruction, all the Great Migration, all these things help explain what's going on in society, what underlying factors are creating whatever we see in 1850 or 1950 or today. So, I want to talk about this a little bit because there's debate about this structural violence. Again, don't worry about reading all of this. This is also from this report. So I put it up there. So the first thing this report says in 1922 now is that all of this discrimination and being treated poorly has a psychological effect. And one thing they're saying is that I put in blue or whatever that color is. They're saying that, and they're talking about criminals. Okay, they're saying that ostracism, exploitation, and petty daily insults, which I guess we call microaggressions today, but to which they, meaning Negroes, are exposed, have provoked a reaction that doesn't value society. And if you think about society the way Ingalls talked about it, it's in opposition to the rules. Why would you want to be friendly with a country that puts you in slaves and keeps mistreating you? There's no reason to do that. So even in 1922, people understood that this was the daily life of black people in Chicago, and that you shouldn't be surprised if there are problems from that. I found this interesting, too, in this report, what they call an effective environment. So again, think about this. The words that they're using to describe these concepts differ. They differ by historical time, and they differ by discipline. What they're really saying is some neighborhoods have a toxic environment. When David Stovall comes, he's going to talk about how we created a situation where you disinvested from communities and made them toxic. You closed the factories, you closed the schools, you closed the parks. Okay. You don't police them. Okay. And are you really surprised that Inglewood is the way it is? When I first came to Chicago, Inglewood was the second largest commercial district in the city of Chicago. 63rd and Halsted had the biggest business outside of the loop. Inglewood is a community, unlike some of our communities, where most of the property is single-family homes. So how does that kind of community disappear? It's not by accident. The other thing I wanted to mention, I had this here so I can remember this. Our notion of what communities look like, what's a safe community, what's not a safe community, what's criminal activity, and what's not a criminal activity, depends on our understanding how structural factors work. So if you make a decision that black people and the newest group of immigrants are dangerous and subhuman, that's what goes on. The 1919 riot was between working class communities, between the black working class community and Canaryville, Bridgeport, and both athletic clubs, otherwise known as gangs. Okay. So some athletic clubs, like the Daly's Club, the Hamburger. So the real Mayor Daley, the original Mayor Daley, was a gangbuster. He was a gangbanger. He came out of these clubs, these same clubs in 1919 that were functioning. Okay, they were known to be. It's not like this. They were known to be gangs. And one of the recommendations that this report makes is maybe we ought to stop, maybe we ought to disband those gangs. But they were white gangs. And so they produced mayors and became part of the power structure. Okay? Because they weren't black. If you don't understand your Chicago history, then you don't learn that. You don't know that. Here's some recommendations. There's a whole chapter already. Here's the title so you can Google it. The Negro in Chicago, the Chicago Commission on Race Relations. So if you Google that, you'll get this PDF that's a giant book. So they have a whole bunch of recommendations. I won't bore you with them. But they have recommendations for all different. So this is one thing. Unlike some of our public health recommendations. Unlike Healthy People 2.0. Nice recommendation. They have recommendations for everybody. They said, this is what we recommend for Negroes. This is what we recommend for white civic organizations. This is what we recommend for the white press. This is what we recommend for the black press. This is what we recommend the police do. This is what we recommend city council does. So they have recommendations based on specific sectors. And one thing they said is for this vicious environment, the environment that produces crime, They said, get the criminals out of the black neighborhoods. A lot of the criminals that were in the black, like prostitution houses, gambling houses, Al Capone hung out in the, in the juke joints, okay? They said, that shouldn't be, white neighborhoods wouldn't tolerate that. They said, well, first of all, give them, and enforce the law fairly. They said fairly. So they're saying one reason neighborhoods are infested with crime and people are afraid is because the police make a decision to let that happen. So if a 70-year-old grandmother like me can look out on the corner and see 3 or 4 drug deals going down, a professional police can't? Why does that happen? What's so unique about these little young 16, 17, 20, 30-year-olds selling drugs? They're not invisible. They don't have superpowers. So it's not enough just to say, oh, well, they need an education. They need all of that things. Mentoring. They have, and by the way, every recommendation you can think of is in here. Okay, so when they want you to write a grant and be innovative, just go back to this book from 1922. But the point is, they make it very clear. There was a decision to allow this to happen. A decision not to enforce certain laws. A decision to allow rundown houses. A decision to redline certain neighborhoods. Read the law. So again, don't just say redlining was bad. Go back and read the federal law that explained how they were going to do the redlining. And they talk about some more stuff about policing. And here's where they recommend that the athletic clubs of the South Side, the original gangs, Chicago gangs, be controlled and perhaps abolished. Then maybe Mayor Daley wouldn't have been mayor. So, this concept then that health is connected with the structural foundation of society is not new. And while I'm concentrating on structural violence, this is really the history of our field, for even for Western public health, for a long time. And even the history of medicine at some level. And then comes along Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is a mental health. So now this I want to be clear with you, because so now we're going to get into some modern controversy. The Native American scholars, I think, have made a major contribution when they talk about this concept of historical trauma, which is different than what Ingalls was talking about, or Farmer, or Galton. What Braveheart argues is that historical trauma is cumulative. Now, she is a mental health worker. Okay? So I'm going to be talking about levels of intervention here. But she argues that historical trauma is cumulative, it's emotional and psychological, it's wounding, it's serious, and it crosses generations. So you can see how an indigenous scholar would come to this notion. She's clinically seeing her people and is arguing that one has to have a theoretical frame to think about that. There have been studies about this, but there are also studies with Holocaust survivors. That's another example. So what happens to a European Jewish people that goes through the Holocaust? Are there any remnants of that? Well, there are a bunch of remnants. One, we have Israel taking away rights from Palestine. That's a remnant of it. But also, in an individual level, on a clinical level, we have Jews all over the world, and for the diaspora, whose children and grandchildren are not functioning just by their little individual lives, but also by what historical trauma happened to their people, So again, I invite you to Google her, look her up, read some of her work. This is not from her. I just put it here because this is a public health audience, and for some reason, it's very interesting to me that academics all have our own anthropology and traditions. So, we like diagrams like this. I don't know why. You're right. You see these a lot. We like to do a conceptual. So this is a conceptual diagram that someone wrote up. I don't want to argue for it or against it, but I put it up there because we're in public health, so we'll put it. We'll put it up to look at it. And this is an argument. So here's an argument. Don't worry about all the words. This is an argument. After Braveheart starts publishing her work, and there's more and more studies about this, Dr. DeGruy is a sister. She's also a mental health person. Okay? So here you have two clinicians dealing with mental problems. Okay? And she puts out this book after she's working in this area for a long time. I think it's a respectful book, The Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Okay? So, again, the notion that Engels first talks about, in terms of the British working class and why they might be drunk, the notion that Braveheart talks about what it means to a people to have genocide committed on them, from the group, what it means to a people who have survived slavery. Okay? And both of these mental health leaders and the community that surrounds them develop approaches and interventions on a clinical level and a family level, and at some point on a neighborhood level that try to address this framework. So Native Americans try to go back and have people listen to the stories of the elders. They try to teach the language. They try to teach some of the rituals that were lost in the boarding schools, etc. Black nationalists here and others try to go and they try to have manhood classes and try to add some ritual back as a way to arm individuals and families and communities against the onslaught from a society that thinks we're subhuman. So when I was young, to say black, when I was little, you didn't call anybody black. That was like an insult. When I was little, people called us colored, and we had to fight to be called Negro. So to say black is beautiful was a revolutionary notion, and used to provide defense and what we talk about in public health, resilience to this oppression. But it's a clinical level intervention. And my brother here, Kendi, whose book. Now, if you're not a clinician, you don't want to read that book. I mean, you could, but if you're a nurse, if you're a clinician, if you're doing social work, that might be a good book for you to read. Just like Braveheart stuff is good. This book, everybody should read. Stamped from the Beginning. It's a good book. It's about history. It's about the history of racism in the United States. He went berserk over it. This is something he wrote, that he felt this idea of post-traumatic slave syndrome was racist. I actually don't agree with him on that. But what I want to point out is that individual level intervention can be taken over by the right wing and used against you. What does it mean? What's one of the logical outcomes of our present epigenetic notions? Again, when I was in medical school, epigenetics didn't exist. If you had suggested that something that happened to you could be passed down to your children, they would have laughed you out of medical school, probably taken away your license. Now, in epigenetics, we talk about inheritable traits passed down through generations. This allows some people to argue, well, blacks really are inferior. Maybe it's not their fault, but if they were in slavery for 200, 300 years, and they got messed up, and now it's in their DNA, and we're just inferior. And we all know Native Americans aren't, right? So, one of the real challenges as we use these concepts is they are not without value. And if you don't understand the history of the concept, what you agree with and what you don't agree with, what the literature really says, not what we tell you from these podiums, then it's easy to wind up doing bad stuff when you think you're doing good stuff. I would argue, my personal take on this kind of debate is that the problem here is that you're talking about different disciplines functioning at different levels. On one hand, you have a mental health professional functioning at an individual, family, and neighborhood level, talking about clinical interventions. I don't have time. You know, if you're raising a son in Chicago, you don't have time to wait for everything to be right. You try to make sure your son makes it home at night. So you teach them how to deal with the police when you get stopped. You know, I don't care what your politics are. That's what you got to do. Okay. If you're a historian, or if you're looking at a macro level, you can say, this is some bullshit, and we need to get rid of the police. We need to change how they function. Okay. But you can't say that and just ignore your son, because your son might be dead while you're trying to get rid of the police. So this is the real world that we function in public health. We should be able to eliminate poverty in this country. There's no reason why we shouldn't. But we have to pay attention to idiot regulations about the SNAP program if we want people not to starve to death. Or what's going to happen if this government shutdown continues for a couple months, and some states are not going to have money to extend SNAP benefits, and we're going to have people without food stamps. So one of the tasks that we have difficulty doing, everybody does, it's not unique to public health, but especially in public health, is we have trouble functioning on more than one level at a time. But collectively, we have to function on all levels. Individually, you can only function on one level at a moment, but you can function on multiple levels over the space of a day or a week or a year. So if all you're doing is a mentorship program to help young teenage girls not get pregnant, if that's all you're doing, then you're not doing much. If you can do that and have some understanding of the structural conditions that force young women in this country to have unwanted pregnancy, then you might be able to make some progress. So that to me is the real challenge with this concept of structural violence. And I would be remiss, I don't know, I can't remember, did we put them on the agenda? No? Yes. Okay. All right, so let me say this. I'm sorry that they're not here. I would say it anyway. I was working at the city Department of Public Health under Harold Washington when Gary first came, when I first met him, and he had this notion that violence was an epidemic disease, like an infectious disease. He's trained in infectious disease, if I remember correctly. So he's coming to meet me. I'm at the health department. He's trying, he's from CDC. He's not from CDC. He had worked at CDC. He's trying to convince me that this is like an infectious disease and we have to root it out like an infectious disease. Now, I just told you, I'm the mother of a black man, which I haven't recovered from yet. He's 47, but you can never rest. You never know. But anyway, so it's not that I was, my son wasn't 47 when Gary first came. This was earlier. He was a young man. So it's not that I thought that some of his ideas were wrong or weren't useful. If, like my son tells me, if you want to talk to knuckleheads, you have to find a knucklehead or a former knucklehead. So, I mean, this is what the interrupters is. Because they know how to talk to each other. That makes sense. If you want to address what goes on among young men in their head, you got to talk to them. You got to have them talk to each other. So there are lots of things in Cure Violence that we're very proud of in the school that makes sense. They're not the only program. They're not the first program. They're not the only program. But I deeply resent, on a theoretical level, on an intellectual level, this notion that violence is an epidemic disease. This goes completely against everything that the rest of the public health world thinks about. It goes against how the WHO conceives of violence. It goes against how Gallup conceives of violence. But we don't talk about it very much in the school, okay? Which is bad. To me, we should have a debate. I wanted to have it in the classroom. We could have a debate about it. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this kind of approach? Only. But more importantly, what will you think about it? Now, believe me, I was polite to Gary. I had never had a fight with him. I disagree with him if we're talking about something, we usually disagree about this. So, but if you're a public health professional and this program comes across your school or it comes to your organization where you're working, are you going to be able to evaluate that program in a way that makes sense? Are you going to be able to make suggestions to improve the program? Do you have a critical, not criticism of, a critical view toward what we do, what you do, what your institution does, what your school does, what your government does? That to me is very important. Why else are you paying all this money to get a degree? We're not a religion. And if you think that's what's going to go on, trust me, in 10 years, all the jargon will change. 15 years ago, nobody talked about health equity. It took us 15 to 20 years to get them to talk about health equity instead of health disparities. Okay. So you have to be critical. You have to think. You have to ask questions. You can do it in a civil way. I'm not very civil, but you all are more polite than me. You can do it in a civil way. You don't have to be rude about it. But you do have to ask the questions. What are we doing and how are we doing it? And why is it important? I don't have time to go through all the other groups. Every story is different, not in terms of individual narratives, in terms of the history. The history of New York is different than the history of Chicago. The history of Cleveland is different. The history of Phoenix or Albuquerque is different. Mexico City, they're all different. But the theoretical frame may have major similarities. And by studying the specifics of where you're working, or the specifics of different histories, you begin to develop some feeling for the kind of theoretical frame you might want to attack. I do want to point out a couple of important books about one of our major immigrant groups here, Chicago Mexicans. So, Mexicans didn't first come to Chicago in Pilsen and Little Village. That's the first thing. But one thing that helps you with history is you just don't sound stupid. Okay? Mexicans settled, the Circle campus is built where Mexicans, Negroes, it was actually an interracial community. Asians, all were over there around Hofstede. But most Mexicans came at first and worked in the steel mills in the southeast part of the city, where there are still a lot of Mexican Americans. But anyway, this one book by John Flores, who comes from the southeast side, South Side boy, The Mexican Revolution in Chicago. This is an important, there are a number of great books. This is one of the recent ones. And he really talks about how Mexican immigrants in the early years of Chicago very much were reflecting fights in Mexico. And he talks about how they had relationships with Nicaraguans and et cetera. This is a wonderful book to look at. And I would be shot if I didn't mention our own Dr. Kerr, Heather Kerr, who got her degrees from University of Illinois and served on our faculty on the East Campus for a number of years. And again, her thesis, I don't know if this is easily available. If you're interested in it, let me know and I'll send it to you. Her thesis, the Chicano, so what does this tell you? This tells you when she graduated, right? Chicano, the fact that she uses that term. But anyway, the Chicano experience in Chicago, 1920, 1970. Again, a perfect example of another community health assessment. This is where people live. This is what we did. So, if you're doing capstones and you're doing a thesis, look at some of these older efforts and to see really what's going on. I want to leave lots of time for questions. So, every issue, this just happens to be medical insurance, every issue that we think about, I don't care whether it's opioid overdose, the lack of people with health insurance, teenage pregnancy, not using seatbelts, name something that you would work on or think about in public health or any other field, and it has real impact. This just happens to be a study from 2009 that indicates if we don't have the level of health insurance we had then, 45,000 people died each year because they didn't have health insurance. You could have these kind of numbers if you want for almost anything. How many people are harmed or die because we don't have birth control? Or because you can't learn how to read in the public school? I mean, you think about it. So when you see a problem or a success, ask yourself, how did we get that Rhodes Scholar? Okay. Not just how did Laquan McDaniels happen to get murdered. Okay. You can ask it both ways. Because what you need to produce each one of those outcomes is very different. But when we study it always in the negative, then we tend to forget the community assets. We tend to forget about resilience. We tend to forget about the positive things. If we studied it in a more holistic way, How do we produce high school graduates where 90% of them do great? That's what we need to be asking ourselves. There's one article that I think you've been assigned, the DeMille and Ansel article, right? Okay. This is an excellent starting place. Now, David is a good friend, and I don't know what he thinks about structural violence. I'm going to ignore him. Fernando is great, though, and I know that he did a lot of the thinking behind this. He is a sociologist, okay? And that article lays out the problems that they see, and I agree 100% with what Fernando's saying, and how we presently think about and talk about structural violence. First, we have a tendency, because this is like the in thing now, so, I mean, we have a tendency to act like it's new, okay, like somebody just thought it up. And even saying from 1969, that's really, I know it seems like a long time ago to y'all, but really, that's new in the world of academia. So that's the first problem. And then we don't think about it, because we think it's new, we don't think about it in a historical point of view. Where did that idea come from? Has it been used in a good way? Has it been used in a bad way? They argue that the present notion of structural violence is a-theoretical, without theory, and therefore without politics. Now, that's not Engels. You can agree with him or not. Engels wasn't a-theoretical or apolitical. He had a theory to underlie what he thought social murder was. Okay, that's what we call it Marxism today. He had a theoretical frame that he was putting in all the things he was saying about the English working class. I would like you all to agree with me, but that's not the point I'm trying to make tonight. The point I'm trying to make tonight is there is a theoretical frame that you're working under, and you would be better served by understanding what it is. So when we stand up here and tell you that we do evidence-based public health, I want you to scream. Okay? Because we don't do that. What that means is we do status quo public health, and we don't want to think about structural factors. That's what that means. That means we don't understand science. You know, that's like a cry from a field with inferiority complex. If you want to emphasize that one ought to think about evidence, then talk about evidence informed, like Canadians do, if you feel a need to do that. If you forget what Durkheim told us, which is medicine is politics. But if you have trouble, understand that. I don't know if any of the theoretical frames, the traditional ones that exist today, are adequate. I'm sure more theoretical frames will be invented tomorrow. What Fernando talks about is, he mentions Nancy Krieger's eco-social theory. That's an important theory in terms of causation of disease, but some of those theories are rooted in Marxism. Some of them are rooted in lifespan and psychology. There's a whole range of eco-social theories. So when you read a paper, when you're reading a body of work, understand what the frame is. First, you don't have to agree or disagree. When I read a book, the first thing I do is try to understand what they're talking. I try to get inside their mind. What are these people talking about? How are they thinking? Okay? And believe me, Trump is thinking something. Okay? And it helps you if you understand how he's thinking. Okay? I think the problem we have that Fernando has with structural violence is the same problem I have with social determinants of health. It's done in an ahistorical, atheoretical, and apolitical way. For those of you that don't remember, this is Nancy's model, eco-social model. The main thing I would say about this, I prefer this model when I'm talking to an American audience because I think it's easier for us to understand, is it has that nice box on historical context and generation. I think that's important. And these you've seen, but let's talk about them for a minute. So this is a WHO model, which can be a little confusing. Why? Because the WHO is a political organization. They had all kinds of fights within the Committee on the Social Determinants of Health that worked on this report. It's 10 years old now, I guess, right? Yeah, it came out in 2008. They had all kinds of arguments when this was going on. So that's the other thing that you have to demand, which is why this course is so important. You have to demand to know what the real adults are arguing about. And like most old people, we don't like telling the young people what we're really arguing about. we'd rather convince you that we're right, so let me just teach you what I think, and then if you just do what I say, and by what I think, you'll be okay. But that's not good. All of you have passed the toddler stage. So start figuring out when the adults are arguing. So one of the things they were arguing about with the WHO committee was how you even measure inequity. Some people argued that it was impossible to talk about inequities on a population level. What do you think about that? These were Americans that were arguing this, by the way. Some, not the official, but a number of American researchers were arguing, and you'll see it in our literature. It doesn't make sense to talk about this stuff on a population level. And they have eloquent epidemiological reasons why. Not everybody with high blood pressure is black. Why talk about high blood pressure in black people being healthy? What are you crazy? Now, the WHO rejected this, and they insisted this was a population level concept. So they had arguments about what roles these structural things play. They had arguments about what words they should use. The report doesn't use racism, for example. It's a political outcome of the report. I think they use discrimination and other kinds of little euphemisms. So these things are argued about. They were argued about in 2008, and they're being argued actively today. So like when you go to APHA or any of these other places, it's like major shit going down, and if you don't know about it, you miss half the fun. That was one thing I liked when I was a little girl. I liked staying up and listening to when the old folks argued. That's when you found out what really was happening. So not only do we concentrate on the social determinants of health, on the intermediary factors. So in many of our public health courses, I know this is not true for you all. Not a Jenny talk, I know this is not true. But anyway, but in many of our schools of public health, we act as though the social determinants of health are the root causes. And everywhere else in the world, they don't have to agree with my politics. Everywhere else in the world, they know that's not true. They don't even think about it. Those are intermediary causes. But if you stop at the social determinants of health, then you can act like they're character traits. That drives me crazy too. Well, the reason black men die early is because of the social determinants of health. What does that mean in English? Well, they get discouraged. They don't have mentors. They don't have high self-esteem. They're undisciplined. Now I could talk about men forever. I could. Okay. But that's not why black men are healthier or unhealthy. In and of itself. The social determinants of health are not a barrier. They are there for good or ill. Everybody has some economic status, and that helps determine their health. It helps determine whether they can get an x-ray. It helps determine whether they can afford their medicine. So it's not enough just to say, oh, some people can't afford their medicine. Today, we have type 1 diabetics dying around the country because the goddamn pharmaceutical companies have tripled or quadrupled the cost of insulin, one of our oldest drugs. That has nothing to do with the fact that some people that are homeless really can't afford 50 cents for their insulin. Those are two separate kind of problems. Well, actually, they have the same root cause, but they're two separate levels of the problem. So it's the structural determinants that we need to pay attention to. I don't like these graphs because they say structural determinants of health inequities. No, they're the structural determinants of health. Period. Good health or bad. So if you have trouble describing how voter suppression impacts infant mortality, you need to go and get your tuition back. Okay? So this is like Public Health 101. If you understand how the industrial nature of our region changes and how that impacts people's health, that's critical. So these structural determinants, how do other people vote in the world? This is room for debate. We could argue forever about what the structural determinants to make a healthy country ought to be. But I would love to have that argument. It's like, many of y'all have a significant other? Some of you, right? Or have had, right? Okay. All right. So, like, when you fight, you want to fight over what you're really having trouble with. I don't want to fight over whether the toilet seat is up or down. I mean, it's irritating. But that's not what I want to fight. I don't want to fight about whether the socks are on the floor or not. Let's fight about something real. Okay. That's how I feel about this debate. You all are public health professionals. Let's fight about something that's real. And if you don't know how other countries vote, how they set up their so-called democracies, because we're supposed to be, then you're a toddler in the room. You can't intelligently discuss whether Trump won the election or not, because you have no clue how we vote. Most Americans have no clue how we vote, and they have no clue about how other people vote. We don't have one person, one vote, never have had. The country wasn't set up that way. So you can't talk about changing things if you don't understand how things are set up. And it's hard. I had the privilege of living in Canada for a couple of years, and I'm going to tell you, until I actually lived there, I never understood parliamentary. Now think about it. Most of the world, most of the so-called capitalist world has a parliamentary system of government. So I never understood how parliaments work. I really had no clue. In fact, I used to wonder when they would say on the news, France has something and the government might fall. I was saying, like, how could a government fall? I wish we had that now. Anyway, okay. So only when I went to another country and got to observe carefully how the parliamentary system at least works in Canada, and there's differences everywhere, then you can have some hope of understanding what's going on. When you tell high school kids, some of you have seen Unnatural Causes, right? You've seen that hopefully, or some people. I remember showing that to a group of high school students, black and Latino high school students one time, and I asked them at the beginning, we show one of them, and I said, was there anything there that surprised you? You know what they said? They said, was it really true that in France, you don't have to, or Germany, whatever country, you don't have to pay for college? You don't have to pay college tuition? I said, yeah. They were like shocked. But that's, they were high school students that's been thinking of, And not only that, I said, in the United States, in some places like New York City, back in the day, you didn't have to pay for it either. Okay. But if you cannot make a link between that and food insecurity on this campus, we're in trouble. How do we have college students, which we do, unfortunately, at levels usually above the national general population, on this campus at DePaul, all these food insecurity? You have to go back to the structural causes. And when someone comes and asks you, when you're working in some health department, or you're sitting in an academic institution, or you're working at a community health center, okay, or a social service agency, someone comes and asks you, what policy should we be put in place about guns, or about cigarettes, or about soda pop? And you begin to spout some policy, and you don't have any ability to even think how these structural changes might ripple down to a specific community or a specific family or a specific individual, then you're committing public health malpractice. So we should not ask ourselves what's politically possible. Right now, we cannot get a single-payer bill out of Congress, this Congress right now. When Barack Obama went to D.C., before he was elected, he supported single-payer. Nice young legislature, we beat it into his head, he supported single-payer. Okay. When he gets there, all of a sudden, he's not even going to consider single-payer. The question is not what policy makes the most sense. Bill Clinton had a whole health task force for health reform. Y'all were little then, you probably don't remember. Okay. And he put his wife, Hillary, as the co-chair of that health task force. And I remember she came to an APHA executive board meeting and walked in the room, she had good people to prep her, and said, I know y'all support single payer, but we ain't discussing it because it's not politically easy. Okay. And today, most people who say they support single payer don't even know what it is. Have you, in your basic courses, looked at our medical system in this country? I don't think it's as important as our public health, or lack of public health system. But how can you not understand it? You know how it compares to other countries? Then you're not ready for real policy change. The WHO is a consensus model. It's a consensus organization. It has all 100 and something different countries, from Saudi Arabia to the United States to more rational countries in it. And they have political fights all the time about what they're doing and what they're supporting. Compared to the United States official public health, it's in advance of us. Okay? But that doesn't mean it's where we need to be. The People's Charter happens to be a criticism of the WHO in general from the left, which is obviously, you can figure it out, are my personal inclinations. But again, it doesn't matter what your theoretical frame is. You need to know about where the arguments are taking place. What are the arguments from the left against the WHO model? What are the arguments from the right against the WHO model? Don't come to me and talk to me about structural factors and social determinants of health if you can't discuss that. Then I'm willing to listen to whatever you think it ought to be. So when you listen to your speakers that are going to come in, and they're going to be focused on their area, and I can't remember the list, not everybody that comes in is going to be a health person. That's okay. Actually, that's good, because they're going to use language and jargon that we don't normally use. They're going to use terms that may mean the same thing, or may be a takeoff, or we may have, more likely, take off from some concept that they have. So read widely. Read real books, not the peer-reviewed literature. We force you to read that, but that's not real. You don't have time there to develop anything in a peer-reviewed article. Read real books. Read history. And ask hard questions. And ask how what David Stovall is talking about in the elementary school connects up with what's going on in Haiti. Or how police murder changes or not lynching in the United States. Or why is it that Mexican Americans that were lynched in as high of numbers, proportions as blacks, are not recognized as being victims of lynching? Ask those questions. You will spend the next, hopefully, 50, 60, 70 years in this field. And we need you to think, to know how to think, to read broadly, and to stand up and speak for what you think is right. Thank you. I have questions and debates. Questions, comments, other books. I could have spent the whole slide just on books. Read this book. No questions? Yeah. Well, the more you read, the more you have a chance to do that, because you'll see them fighting with each other. Oh, I'm sorry. She's asking, how do you figure out what the grown-ups are fighting about? Well, first of all, you're probably fighting about them too. Okay, so don't let them treat you like your children.